Go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who have not yet met me, my name is Krista Reinhardt. I am the new Director of Family and Parent Engagement here at Center College. So if you haven't already gotten various emails for Family Weekend and Commencement and other family activities from me, you will in the future. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is the first in kind of a new informational series of Zooms and other conversations that we're hoping to start with center families to help keep you guys connected to the college, and also just inform parents and families and alumni with college age students like myself who want some more information about the process and the college stage of life. My daughter is 16, so we are just starting the college search. And I was telling Chad as we were chatting before the meeting tonight that it's been a bit of an eye-opener to me as someone who grew up here on Center's campus, went to Center, went to graduate school, and back at Center for 12 years. Thought I knew an awful lot about higher education until I started trying to help my daughter choose a college and navigate things like the financial aid process. So I'm as eager to hear what Chad has to say as all of you guys do. So a couple of quick notes. We are recording tonight's session so that we can post it to YouTube and include a link in the family and alumni newsletters later this week for anybody who doesn't get a chance to see it, or if any of you just want to share it with someone else in your family or a friend or whoever who you think might benefit from this information. That will be available. And without any other tidbits to share, I will jump right to it and introduce Chad Spencer. He is our Vice President of Student Enrollment here at Center College. He came to us from Davidson, where he's worked in their admissions department for nearly 20 years. So he's got a whole bunch of background and knowledge about this area. So I'm going to let Chad take it away, as he is the guru in this area. I'm certainly not. So Chad, it's all you.
Great. Thank you, Krista. And hello to all the folks who are tuning in tonight. Thank you for taking the time to tune in and hear what I have to say on this topic, which I know is of great interest right now, and I believe to be of great importance as families navigate this process. And whether you have a student or students who are in high school right now, or perhaps even younger, or you have students who are already enrolled in college, you're at Center right now, I believe that what I present will be helpful. So regardless of your situation, I hope what you take tonight, you're able to apply to your own individual circumstances. Just to give you a little more quick background on me, I have been working in admission and financial aid for 25 years, the last nearly 20 of which were spent at Davidson College in North Carolina. I am originally from Chicago, went to high school in Florida, and found my way north to North Carolina to attend college. I've served as a director of financial aid. I've served as a senior associate dean of admission. So I've worked in this field for a quarter century now. I have two sons who've both navigated this college search process, and I can relate to what Krista shared about working in higher ed for such a long time. And yet when it becomes you who are working through this process along with your student, suddenly things change a little bit. And there are things you learn that you expected you would have known after spending many years working in this field or this industry. So I hope you all are excited about what lies ahead if you've not yet worked through this process. I have a few goals tonight, one of which is that in an hour or so, we'll be going our separate ways, and you will have the information you need in order to move forward. I hope, too, that you'll feel less anxious about the financial aid process because of the knowledge you gain tonight. And I hope, thirdly, you'll feel confident in moving forward with this process as well because of that knowledge that you've gained. I also want to put out there from the beginning that the financial aid office and the admission office at Center stands ready to support you in this. So as questions come, I invite you to contact me or to contact any of our financial aid staff. And before we finish the night, we'll put into the chat my email address as well as the general email address for the financial aid office at Center. It's also important to know that tonight's presentation is set up in such a way to where, as you'll see on this first slide, that every slide title is a question. So I'll ask a question and I will set out to answer that question. I suspect some of you have come into tonight's program with questions prepared. I imagine we'll touch on many of them, but potentially not all. So I also invite you to drop questions into the chat so that at the end of our time together, we can work through a Q&A time and I can get those questions answered for you. So jumping into it, let's talk about what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about applying for financial aid. If there's one thing I've learned in 25 years of working in admission and financial aid, it's that if you don't apply for financial aid, you will not receive financial aid. So it's important that we work through that process in detail, and we will. We'll also talk about cost of education in a way that goes beyond sticker price. I don't know how you feel about the sticker price of college right now, but for me, with a son who's a college freshman, it gave me heartburn as we were thinking about the places he was considering, which were all private liberal arts colleges. So we're going to break that down to better understand the components of the total cost of education. Then we'll focus on need-based financial aid so you can understand what happens with all the data that you're submitting within the financial aid documents, what's happening with it as it's processed and it's analyzed, and ultimately what colleges are doing with it in order to determine eligibility for need-based financial aid. Then we'll switch gears and talk about merit-based scholarships and non-need-based aid. In my opinion, this is an effective way to pay for college, so it deserves some time, and we'll talk about how students may position themselves as competitive merit scholarship candidates. We'll compare financial aid packages for different institutions side by side so you can see the differences in the way that colleges go about awarding their available funding. And then we'll cover federal changes. That's the hot topic right now. As things are changing with the federal system, people are wanting to understand what it is that's changing and how that may impact them. So we'll do our best tonight to walk through that process and talk about those areas of change. And finally, I'll close with some consumer tips. How do students apply for financial aid? I first want to draw your attention to the left-hand side of the screen where you see that this is an annual process. And the reason I bring that up first is because in my experience, I have found that oftentimes students who are returning students, so they've finished the first year of college, they're returning for a sophomore year, they tend to miss deadlines much more often than students who are entering college for the first time. In high school, students are reminded often about the things they need to be doing as they prepare for entry into college. So understandably, they meet deadlines and they do what's required of them. Please keep in mind year over year that applying for financial aid happens in the fall. So be prepared to do that each year your students returning to college. Nearly every college and university in the country requires the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. We all require it because we award federal financial aid programs. In order to participate in them, we must collect the FAFSA from students to determine whether or not they are eligible for those federal aid programs. It is free, so please don't pay to complete the FAFSA. You may find it at studentaid.gov. This is where you can establish an account, and that really begins the process. And this too is where you will complete and submit the FAFSA. The FAFSA in most years, or at least the last 8 years, opened on October 1st. This year, however, as most of us understand well, the FAFSA will open in December. We've not been given a specific date by the federal government as to when it will open. All they have told us is that it will open by December 31st. So my best advice to you, my encouragement to you is be prepared to complete the FAFSA when it opens. Colleges and high schools and many other agencies are going to be advertising as soon as they understand when the FAFSA is going to open that date so that people can be aware and complete it. So if you have a high school senior at home, please complete the FAFSA as soon as it opens so that your student may be able to provide their information to the colleges where they're applying for admission. And if you have a student who's returning to college, I also advise that you move forward with completing the FAFSA for your returning student as soon as it opens. The FAFSA collects income information and asset information along with some household information. For next academic year, fall of 2024, you will be using your 2022 federal tax data to complete the FAFSA. Within the FAFSA, you have the ability to link your IRS record to your FAFSA record, which will allow for the automated flow of that data directly from the IRS into the income section of your FAFSA, which saves you the hassle of doing all of the data entry yourself. It will also eliminate any possibility of error. So be on the lookout for that as you're working through the FAFSA this year, because that is something that exists now that is also mandatory. The asset section you will complete on your own, and the assets will be reported, at least the value of those assets will be reported as of the date and time you are completing the FAFSA. So you will not have to look back to 2022 account statements in order to determine the value of assets. I'm often asked the question of who completes the FAFSA. And one of the people who will complete the FAFSA is the student, because it is considered the student's financial aid record. Along with the student, the other responsible party will be biological or adoptive parents if they are married and or living together. So they too will submit their data along with the student. In cases of divorce, separation, or the parents having never married and they're not living together, then the responsible party is the person who provides the greatest amount of financial support to the student. Oftentimes, that is the person who the student lives with the majority of the time, but that's not always the case. So the deciding factor of who provides their information along with the student in cases of divorce or separation boils down to who provides the greatest amount of financial support to the student. That's the FAFSA. The CSS profile is another financial aid document that is required by some colleges, not all. There are a couple hundred of them that require the CSS profile. If you'd like to find a full comprehensive listing of those colleges, please visit collegeboard.org, and there you will find all of those who require it. Most often, these tend to be private colleges who are using their own financial resources to meet the overwhelming majority of students' financial need. So it tends to be those that are most highly selected. Much like the FAFSA, it collects income and asset information along with household information. There's also a narrative section within the CSS profile that allows for an explanation of any unusual circumstances families may be facing. And lastly, at the college's discretion, they may require you to provide tax returns, W-2 forms, and other federal financial tax documents. And there may be institutional aid forms that have to be completed separately from the FAFSA and or the CSS profile. That's the application process. Well, what happens next? How is need-based aid eligibility determined? You see here a simple, straightforward equation that begins with the cost of education, which we know to be variable from college to college. Subtracted from the cost of education is any expected financial assistance or outside resources the student will be receiving. We will also subtract from the cost of education the student aid index, which is the calculated family ability to pay. It was formerly called the expected family contribution, but one of the federal changes is a change from the expected family contribution to the student aid index. The result is the student's financial need. And keeping in mind that this is an annual process, this happens each year. So this is the student's financial need for 1 year. We're going to take this equation and break it down by each individual component, beginning with the cost of education. And you can see here that I've broken it out into direct expenses and indirect expenses. Direct expenses are billable by the college or university. So their finance office, the business office, will issue a bill that includes tuition and fees, of course. And if your student is living on campus and they have purchased a meal plan, then too, they will be billed for food and housing. Now, in cases where the student chooses to live off campus, the food and housing expense will shift from direct to indirect. It's no longer paid directly to the college or university. It is instead paid to the landlord or to the apartment complex, or to whomever owns the housing where they're living. And then when it comes to food, if they are not purchasing a meal plan through the college or university where they attend, then of course they'll be paying for their food elsewhere. So housing and food can shift from direct to indirect. Other indirect expenses include books and supplies. Colleges will include allowances within the total cost of education for books and supplies. Oftentimes, it will be $1,000 to $1,500 that's allowed for books and supplies. Transportation expenses are often dependent upon where the student is traveling to campus from. So where do they live? If they're having to travel a greater distance, then their transportation allowance will be greater than students who have a shorter distance to travel to reach campus. And lastly, miscellaneous personal expenses are included as an indirect cost of education to allow students to live a standard college-going existence. At Center, nearly all of the student activities are provided for within the tuition and fees structure. So we include a relatively low level of allowance for miscellaneous personal expenses. There are other institutions where the cost of student activities is not built into the tuition and fees structure. Therefore, students are paying for most of the things they're participating in on campus. So those colleges may have a higher level of miscellaneous personal expense worked into the total cost of education. So regardless of where your student chooses to attend college, you should expect to find at minimum these 5 components of the total cost of education. Now, the second component of the equation I shared earlier was outside resources. Simply put, these are funds coming from sources other than the college or the university the student is attending. And I most often think about clubs and civic organizations where students are involved in spiritual life, where they've played youth sports, where their parents work, or foundations. So really, my best advice when it comes to searching out outside scholarships is to begin that search close to home. I think it's a wise idea to ask high school counselors where the student attends school if they're aware of opportunities the students may apply for. And parents should perhaps ask their employers in case they have something in place to support the dependents of employees. Outside resources can be beneficial financially in that they may help to replace or reduce student loans that are a part of the greater financial aid package, or in cases where students are offered work through work study, outside resources may replace or reduce work study components of aid awards. In cases where a college does not meet 100% of calculated need, so a family's calculated need is at one level and the amount of aid being offered is at a lower level than that calculated need, then there's what's called a gap within the financial aid package. An outside resource can be an effective way to help to fill that gap between the calculated need and how much aid is being offered by the college or university. In cases where the student is offered a merit-based scholarship, and that's the only thing they're receiving, and it's for some amount less than the total cost of attendance, then an outside resource may be stacked on top of the merit-based scholarship, which will then further reduce the family's contribution. So all of these things can be beneficial to the student in cases where they're receiving merit-based scholarships. I encourage you to ask the colleges and universities where your student is offered admission how outside resources impact financial aid awards at those places. What is the student aid index? Well, the student aid index is the figure that's derived from the financial data that's provided within the FAFSA and or the CSS profile. It represents the family's calculated ability to contribute towards educational expenses. It takes into account factors such as income, assets, and household size. And again, just to drive the point home further, it is annually determined, which means it can change from year to year as a family's financial circumstances change. What are the components of the student aid index? You see here I have them broken out into parent and student, and then further broken out into income and assets. We'll begin with student first. There is a student section within the FAFSA and a student section within the CSS profile where the student must report their data, just like parents will be reporting their own. Now, in the case of student income, students must earn more than approximately $3,500 or so within a tax year to begin generating a contribution from their earnings. What I have found in my experience is that most high school students, even if they are working a part-time job, do not work enough, do not earn enough to generate much in the way of a contribution from their earnings. And as the father of 2 children who both worked in high school, I can tell you that neither of them, working 15 hours a week or so, were able to earn enough money at $8 an hour to generate a contribution towards their college expenses. So for the most part, students who are going directly out of high school into college are not generating a contribution from the income they are earning. When it comes to student assets, students are going to be reporting the value of any cash, checking accounts, savings accounts, any investments that are in their names. So they will be responding to the questions within the FAFSA, reporting asset values. Student assets are assessed at approximately a 20% rate, which means for every $1,000 in student assets, 200 of the $1,000 will become a part of the student aid index. Okay, so students are reporting their asset values, and assets that are owned by the student then will be generating a contribution towards college expenses at approximately a 20% assessment rate. Now, I've reserved the next slide to talk about college savings plans, including 529 plans. So if any of you right now are thinking, well, what about college savings plans, Chad? How are those to be reported, and how do they impact the family contribution calculation? Well, we will talk about that separately in just a moment so that we are clear on how that process comes together. When it comes to parent assets, parents, the first thing to know here, and I hope this gives you some relief, is that your retirement accounts are off limits for financial aid purposes. So if you're like me and you're hoping to retire by the time you're 85 or so, and you've been making contributions towards tax-deferred retirement accounts over the years, those retirement accounts are not considered assets for financial aid purposes. So please do not make the mistake of reporting your retirement account values as an available asset when applying for financial aid. Other non-retirement assets do have to be reported. So just like with the student, you're going to be reporting the value of cash, checking, savings accounts, non-retirement investments, any equity you have in real estate that is not your primary residence. If you're a business owner and there's equity in that business, you report the equity value of your business. If you own a farm and there's equity value in your farm, the same rule applies. You will report the equity value of the farm. All of those are considered assets for financial aid purposes. There are allowances built into the formula to protect a portion of reported assets. What remains is considered your discretionary net worth, and then a percentage of it will become a part of the student aid index. Historically, it's been about 5 to 6% of the discretionary net worth that becomes a part of the expected family contribution, or now the student aid index. And as it relates to income, as I shared earlier, your income data will be flowing directly from your IRS record into the FAFSA. It's an adjusted gross income driven process. Okay, so your adjusted gross income is going to be flowing into the FAFSA. And there are going to be allowances for things like taxes paid, whether they're federal, state, or FICA taxes. There are going to be allowances based upon the size of your family built into the formula. There are other allowances based upon the ages of the parents. There's a long list of these allowances. What remains is considered your discretionary income, and then a portion of the discretionary income will become a part of this total student aid index. So that's how this all comes together, from income and asset for both parents and potentially students as well, if they have anything to report. Now, as promised, what about 529 and other college savings plans? The reason why I dedicate a slide to this is because I find that this is often an area where people misreport, where errors are made when applying for financial aid. 529 plans and other college savings plans are to be reported as the assets of the plan owner. More often than not, in fact, overwhelmingly so, the plan owner is a parent or the parents of the students, and then the student is the beneficiary. So don't make the mistake of reporting the plan as the asset of the beneficiary. Instead, report it accurately as the asset of the owner. Now, when the owner is someone other than the student or the parent, so let me use grandparents as an example. Grandparents start a 529 plan for the student upon their birth, and they're tucking away money over time, and it builds value. How do you report that college savings plan owned by the grandparents? Well, the answer is you don't. You don't report the value of a 529 or other college savings plan owned by grandparents or any other third party, because we're not measuring, the federal government is not measuring the grandparents' ability to pay for college. They're measuring your ability and your student's ability to pay for college. So do not report the plan value when applying for financial aid if it's owned by a third party. However, if a distribution is made from the college savings plan to support the student's college going expenses, so post enrollment, once they're enrolled in college, then the student is to report the distribution as having been received for the tax year in which the distribution was made. So it could be that in the future they're reporting the distribution amount, but they're not reporting the principal value of a 529 or college savings plan that's owned by someone other than the student or parent. I hope I was able to articulate that well. So how does this all come together? You see here the student aid index is calculated by taking the parent contribution, adding to it the student contribution, and then we have the total student aid index, or total family contribution, if you will, for the year. Shifting gears, what about merit-based scholarships? Well, in my mind, merit-based scholarships are funds that are awarded on the basis of factors other than financial need. This is based upon merit. And I think we most often think about academic factors. Has a student achieved at a high level in the classroom? Do they rank highly in their class? Right? Have they demonstrated an ability to do good work academically? So oftentimes colleges are rewarding academic achievement. However, there are also talent-based scholarships. I think about outstanding musicians and artists and people with all those talents that I don't have, right? And then being rewarded for those outstanding talents as colleges hope to attract their talents into their college communities. I think about leadership and community service, outstanding writers. Students are making contributions to community in other really important ways. I include fill in the blank here as one of the factors, because ultimately colleges are going to be awarding merit-based scholarships to reward those things they hope most to attract onto their college campuses. So you're going to find dozens of different merit scholarship factors that colleges are rewarding. So a homework assignment for those of you with students in high school is to begin understanding where your students planning to apply to college, spending time on those college websites, understand whether or not they offer merit-based scholarships. If they do, understand what it is they're rewarding. So what are those factors? And then finally, what are the procedures to be considered? What must the student do in order to be considered for those merit-based scholarships? There may be a nomination process where the student has to be nominated by a high school counselor or by alumni or by someone else. There may be a separate scholarship application the student must complete. And if there is, they're likely going to have to provide some additional materials as well. And in some cases, and I remind students of this often as I'm talking with them about center, is the admission application may also serve as a scholarship application. So it's important to complete that admission application with full effort, right? Make sure to complete every section and take the time to do it well. Some other things about merit-based scholarships. Do all colleges offer merit-based scholarships? No, they don't. The most selective colleges in the country do not offer merit-based scholarships. And typically there's an inverse relationship between selectivity and scholarship availability. So the more highly selective places are going to offer fewer, and those that are less selective are likely to offer more in the way of merit-based scholarships. Colleges will decide for themselves about the allocation of their own resources and where they want to dedicate those financial resources. Is it going to be more towards need-based financial aid or merit-based aid, or will they strike some balance between the two? And oftentimes that decision boils down to a philosophy of, do we want to make ourselves available to students who otherwise couldn't afford to be here. So we're going to provide more in the way of need-based aid, or are we going to reward more in the way of merit to draw those students to campus who we believe to have achieved at the highest level? And as I close talking about the merit-based scholarships, I have found that powerful scholarship candidates provide well-crafted applications, whether that's the admission application or it's the scholarship application. They take time to complete the scholarship application and provide that well-crafted application for review. They also demonstrate genuine interest in the colleges where they're applying for merit-based scholarships. They visit if they can. They meet with college representatives when they're in their area. They spend time on the website educating themselves about those institutions. So demonstrating genuine interest is important. They also are genuine and authentic in their presentation of self. I am asked by students often, Mr. Spencer, how do I distinguish myself from thousands of other applicants in the pool? That's hard to do. And I agree with them. It is hard to do, but there's no better way to do it than to be exactly who you are. Right? Be authentic. Let us know who you are. I promise we want to know. We're not at all interested in understanding who you're not, but we absolutely want to know who you are. And lastly, students challenge themselves all the way through the finish line. So in senior year, they take a challenging course load. They continue to participate in those activities that are important to them. They're making positive contributions to their communities all the way through graduation. And at this time last year, I was having to remind my own child that it was important that he continue to work hard into and through his final semester of high school. If your student is offered a merit-based scholarship, ask questions. Right? Please ask questions and lead with, is this scholarship renewable? You're going to want to know, is it a 4-year scholarship? Which most are, but don't take it for granted. If it's a 1-year scholarship, that you want to know in advance, right? So ask if it's renewable, and if it is, ask about requirements. What must the student do in order to renew that scholarship year over year? Must they maintain a minimum grade point average? Must they complete a minimum number of community service hours? Must they fill leadership roles? Must they live on campus? Sometimes that's the case. Must they go abroad at some point during their college experience? I think my favorite of all time was when I got a call from a student who was majoring in studio arts. And this was during my time at Davidson. And she said, Mr. Spencer, I'm calling to ask a question about my scholarship. I said, sure. What can I help you with? And she asked, must I continue to be an art major in order to continue receiving my art scholarship? So that was a short conversation because the answer was absolutely yes, you must. And then she finished her time as an art major. But oftentimes there are those requirements. If a student's receiving a specific scholarship, then they must continue to study within that program area. Also ask how merit scholarships will affect need-based aid eligibility. Sometimes the response is, well, it won't. It will simply be stacked on top of need-based aid. But in some cases, it may replace or reduce some level of need-based aid that otherwise would have been available to the students. And oftentimes, as I talked about earlier, loans may be replaced by merit scholarships, just like outside resources may replace loans or reduce work eligibility. So please ask questions. What about athletic scholarships? Well, at places that award athletic scholarships, they are awarded by the athletics department. It's the coaches who make those decisions. It's not Chad in the admission office or Kevin in the financial aid office, and instead is the coaches who control the purse strings there. Some students receive full scholarships. They tend to play their games on ESPN and ABC under the bright lights. But for the most part, college athletes who are receiving athletic scholarships are not receiving full athletic awards. They're receiving some amount that's less than the total cost of attendance. And then there are colleges like Center who participate in NCAA Division III, who have athletic programs and outstanding athletic programs at that, but who do not offer athletic scholarship awards. The typical components of financial aid packages include gift aid, which we've talked about, both grant, and scholarship. The source may be the institution, it could be the federal government, it could be the state government. The gift aid is at the end of the day free money that does not have to be repaid, nor does it have to be earned. Self-help, on the other hand, does have to be earned or repaid. So it's going to be awarded in the form of federal work study or campus employment, or it may be awarded in the form of student loans. Of course, employment has to be earned with hours worked, and student loans must be repaid at some point. Not all colleges and universities participate in the federal loan program, although I will tell you that the overwhelming majority do. So here we are in an exercise that I really enjoy. This is the point at which we cover financial aid awards for 3 different types of institutions, and we work through the differences in the way that colleges award financial aid resources. So we're going to spend most of our time focused in the middle section of this slide. This is where we're going to parse through what's gift aid and what's self-help aid. And then our ultimate goal is to work towards the bottom line of, hey, what's it going to cost, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's what people want to know. So I strongly encourage you to do what you can to ignore sticker price, because sticker price for most colleges is not what it's actually going to cost you in terms of net cost after all is said and done as it relates to financial aid awarding. So if we look at our slide here and we focus on cost first, we see variance. We see $63,590 at center. We see $30,000 at the public university, and we see $82,000 at another private university. Then we see the one constant on the slide just below that. That is the student aid index. We're assuming that all 3 of these institutions collected the same data and they all applied the same formula. Thus, they all had the same result. And the result here is a $25,000 student aid index for family contribution for the year. That leaves us with variable need. At center, $38,590 is a relatively high need student. We shift over to the public university, $5,000 in need makes this a low need case at a lower cost institution like a public university. Moving over to the private university at $82,000 cost of attendance, we see $57,000 in need, which makes this a pretty high need case at this institution. Now, shifting down to the middle of the slide. As you begin receiving financial aid award packages from colleges and universities, this is where you need to work to understand what's the gift aid that doesn't have to be repaid or earned, and what's the self-help that does have to be repaid or earned. Let's take on center first. We see a merit scholarship. This is a high-achieving student who's done quite well in high school. They've contributed to community as well, so they're being offered a $25,000 merit award for all that they've accomplished. We see a need-based grant of $6,290, a loan for $5,500, which is the maximum Stafford loan allowed for first-year students who are FAFSA filers. So by virtue of completing a FAFSA and being a first-time college-going student, students are eligible to borrow up to $5,500 maximum. There's an $1,800 work study award, which will allow the student to work 7 to 10 hours a week and earn the $1,800 across the academic year, bringing total aid offered by center to $38,590, which means in this case, the family will pay the $25,000 student aid index, and the student will repay the loan and the interest later. Federal loans begin repayment 6 months after leaving college. So 6 months after graduation is when students should expect to begin repayment of federal Stafford loans. Moving over to the public university, we see $0 in merit-based aid. We also see no grant. We see a $5,000 loan, no work study. So this student has been awarded $5,000 in total aid, meaning need has been met. The family will pay the $25,000 student aid index, and the student will repay the loan and the interest later. And lastly, looking at the private university example, so our highest priced institution, we see zero in merit-based aid. This is a highly selective place that does not offer merit-based scholarships. We see $54,000 in grant aid, so need-based aid, gift aid. No loan. This is a place that doesn't award loans as a part of its need-based packaging model. We see a $3,000 job, which means this student is going to have to work more hours in order to earn the $3,000 in work. A total aid package of $57,000, leaving the family to pay the $25,000 contribution or student aid index. So in all three of these cases, 100% of calculated need has been met. But there are differences in how the colleges go about meeting that need, and ultimately in the bottom line for the family in terms of what they will pay, and for the student what they will repay later. Okay, so I hope this is helpful as you're thinking about what lies ahead in receiving financial aid awards from the colleges and universities where your student is offered admission. Now we're in the home stretch. Once you determine how much you'll need to pay, then of course payment options are something you may be thinking about. Most colleges offer monthly payment plans that will allow you to make interest-free installments over time. These tend to be wildly popular. The federal educational loans are available to both students through the direct Stafford loan program that we just talked about. Students may borrow throughout their 4-year experience. $5,500 is the maximum borrowing eligibility as a freshman. It becomes $6,500 for sophomore year, and then $7,500 for both junior and senior year. Parents are eligible to borrow through the Federal Direct Plus Loan Program if you wish. Unlike students, this approval process requires a credit review, so credit worthiness has to be established, and parents may borrow up to the full cost of attendance minus any financial aid the student is receiving. And private educational loans may be explored by students as well. I simply caution students and families to be aware of the terms and the conditions of the loan. Oftentimes they're not as forgiving as the federal loan programs, but for some families based upon individual circumstances, they may be an option worth exploring. If your financial circumstances change, please communicate those changes to the colleges and universities, either where your student has applied for admission or where they're already enrolled. Most of us have an appeal process or a reevaluation process in place that allows families to submit additional documentation for review and for the colleges to make professional judgment decisions about whether or not the results can be additional financial aid eligibility for that academic year. FAFSA simplification changes. So we're at that point at which the changes are taking effect. This is something in my world that we've been talking about for 4 or 5 years. And finally, with the 24-25 academic year set to begin next fall, we'll see the changes actually implemented. So some of what we expect to see is, for one, a reduction in the number of questions on the FAFSA from greater than 100 to approximately 40. So that's a win for everybody, I think. Secondly, as we've already talked about, what had been referred to as the expected family contribution is now going to be the student aid index. A change, too, is the parent who's responsible for reporting their financial data along with the student in cases of divorce or separation is the person who provides the greatest financial support to the student. In the past, the responsible party was the person who the student lived with the majority of the time. So that has changed. Also, what formerly had been a voluntary process, an optional process of having data transferred from the IRS into the FAFSA is now becoming a mandatory process. Pell eligibility criteria have changed as well. And the expectation here is that there will be upwards of 500,000 to 1 million more Pell eligible students next year enrolled in college as compared to this current year. So Pell eligibility is being expanded substantially. The number of children enrolled in college is no longer being considered within the federal financial aid formula. And this is a hot topic, and this is a question that I receive often. What I can tell you is, while that is true, you will continue to have the opportunity to report the number of students you will have enrolled in college at the same time. So please do report that, because many colleges will continue to consider more than one student enrolled in college as a data point that they will use in determining eligibility for institutional financial aid. So while there's nothing we can do about eligibility for federal aid or state aid programs where that's no longer being considered, colleges and universities themselves are the ones who make decisions about their own institutional resources. So many of us are going to continue to consider the multi-enrollment situations of families when determining eligibility for institutional aid. Untaxed retirement contributions are no longer to be reported as income when applying for financial aid. I consider that a big win as someone with a child in college. In cases where child support is received, it is no longer going to be treated as income in this process either. For families whose income is less than $60,000 a year, they will not be required to report asset values when applying for financial aid. Business and farm values, or at least the equity value of businesses and farms, must be reported when applying for financial aid. That's a change from the past. And lastly, there is an increase in what's called the income protection allowance being built into the formula. This allows for housing and food and living expenses, standard living expenses for families. So the greater the size of the family, the greater the level of income protected within the calculation of each family's ability to pay. So overwhelmingly, the changes are positive, right, with relative few exceptions. Now, as we close, I would like to offer you some consumer tips. For those of you with students still in high school, please consult your child's college counselor as you have questions about the admission and or financial aid process. But as I shared at the outset, we're also happy here at Center College to provide counsel where we can for you. Please avoid scholarship programs and search services that charge fees. If they're requiring the student to pay a fee in order to be considered for the scholarship, then run as fast as you can in the other direction. Right? I've seen too often someone pay $500 for their student to be considered for a scholarship, and then they win a $250 scholarship. So don't find yourself on the losing end of a deal like that. If your student's considering early decision anywhere through a binding early decision plan, please take the time to complete the net price calculator on those college websites where your student's considering early decision. So a quick story about my oldest son. He was considering early decision to a number of places. And I sat down on a Saturday morning with a pot of coffee, and I drank that entire pot of coffee and finished 5 net price calculators at colleges he was seriously considering, because I wanted to know what it was likely going to cost us if he chose to enroll to those places. And because of the binding nature of early decision, I wanted to know that well in advance. Well, ultimately, he chose not to apply early decision. He went early action. So we didn't have to make that determination about whether or not we could afford any place in particular without the ability to compare financial aid awards. But early decision is binding, so you should work through the process of understanding projected cost in advance of making that binding decision. And lastly, do colleges negotiate financial aid awards? Do they match financial aid awards from competitors? The honest answer is, in some cases, yes, they do. Is that true in all cases? No, it's not. So if you do ask a college to negotiate an aid award or to match an aid award from a competitor, don't be offended if they tell you that they don't engage in negotiating aid awards. Many places will offer their best aid award first, knowing that students have limited time to make a decision, and we're all working according to budgets, right? So managing our resources and trying to provide as much aid as we can to students who are offered admission to allow them opportunity and access to our institutions and the education we offer. So with that, I'm going to close and simply say again, thank you for hanging with me. I know that was a lot. I hope it's helpful. I hope you find it will serve as a nice reference as you move forward through this process. And again, I can't stress enough how happy we will be to provide you support through this process as you navigate the financial aid world along with your students. So thank you.
Thank you, Chad. We have gotten a handful of questions, so I'm going to start firing away at you. First, will Center send an email when the new FAFSA date is finally released? Like how will people find out that date?
Yes, we will. Once we know, you will know. We will post it to our website, absolutely, yes. But we will also, for our current student population, send out a notification so that they're aware. We'll also share that with you, Krista, in your office. You can get that out to all parents. And for all of our prospective students who are current seniors and have applied for admission, we will also message them so that they know. Yes, my honest expectation, unfortunately, is, and I don't mean to be a pessimist, I really don't.
December
But this has
31st.
dragged on so long. It would not surprise me at all if it ends up being December 31st. And then we'll have something to do on New Year's Eve. Then we'll have New Year's Eve plans, right?
How you want to ring in the new year, right? It's like doing taxes on that day. All right. Question number 2. What process do you recommend for finding scholarships?
For outside scholarships, I encourage you to, if you have a student in high school, to ask the question of the college counseling office, because they're often aware of local scholarship opportunities. Now, there are also search engines out there. There's one called FastWeb, which historically has been the one that I think is the most reliable. Now, there's a lot there, so you just have to be prepared to parse through it, but you can, it's a pretty nice search engine in that you can enter into it information about the student and their interests and so forth, and then it will, at least to some degree, provide a more manageable listing of available scholarships.
Okay, perfect. If a couple is in the process of divorcing, they're separated, but it's not legally final yet, what do they do as far as determining who fills out the FAFSA this current year?
In cases where divorce is not yet final, but separation has already occurred, then one of the options on the FAFSA is to select the marital status of separated.
Okay.
And then the responsible party is the person who's providing the most financial support to the student.
Okay, which brings me to one of the other questions we've gotten, which is how will they have us document who the financially responsible parent is?
There's not one, and it's not going to be collected. It's really just honor system, if you will. Families make that determination on their own. I'm not aware of any colleges who are going to require families to sign a document attesting to who that person is. It really just boils down to, just reporting based upon what you understand the situation to be.
Cool beans. Are funds rolled over from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA considered as income since they're taxed as income?
Great question. So, in cases of rollovers, no, they should not be counted. I highly encourage you to make contact with the college or university after you've applied for financial aid, just to make sure that that income's not being counted within the financial aid calculation, because a rollover is to be excluded from consideration.
And then final question, if the IRS data transfer is now mandatory, but it has not worked for me in the past, what do I do?
That's a good question also. I hesitate to ever encourage someone to call the FAFSA hotline because I understand how frustrating that can be. My hope is because they are making this mandatory, that all the kinks will be worked out of it and that it will work for families. And if that turns out not to be the case, unfortunately, my best advice is to call the FAFSA hotline.
All right, well, that was the last of our questions. Do you have any more closing comments you want to offer?
My comments are simply thank you again for tuning in tonight. I wish you all the best as you navigate this process. For those of you with current students, as always, if you have questions, please contact me or anyone else in our office. I'm easy to find. I'm the only Chad in the admission and financial aid office, and I'll be more than happy to do whatever I can to help.
Thank you so much for coming. I mentioned at the top of the session that we were going to be linking to this full recording in our upcoming alumni and family newsletters. I'll include both my contact info and Chad's contact info in that little blurb in those newsletters. If you do have any follow-up questions, you can email either of us. I won't know the answers, but I know how to track Chad down. Couple of other quick dates to get on your calendar. We do have another one of these little family fundamental sessions coming up on January 25th. Any of you who have current students at Center, you may have them working on their study abroad applications for the next year. I know there are a lot of really amazing options out there. So we are thrilled to invite and have Adam Chen Dedman, our study abroad leader, come speak to you guys on January 25th. So more information will be coming for that. And then I'll also encourage you and your students to keep a watch out for upcoming information on our second Women's Leadership Conference that we will be hosting here on campus March 8th and 9th. We have Olympic gold medalist Lauren Gibbs coming to give our keynote address. She's got a really inspiring story. She's done a whole lot of human rights work. She's currently engaged with the Posse Foundation, which is a strong partner here at Center College. And then we've got a huge slate of alumni and faculty and staff. It's open to everyone. You don't have to just be a woman. So there are some sessions about toxic masculinity and how to support the women in your life. So there's a whole bunch to offer for everybody. So watch out for more information on both of those sessions in coming weeks. And everybody have a good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Thank you again, Chad.
You're welcome. Good night, everyone.